Hi, welcome everyone to the Smart City Challenge Housing Panel. This is our second week of panel discussions, and as you know, we have a long calendar up until the moment that our competitors are submitting their pitches of panels that involve experts thinking about the future. Today, we are so excited to think about the future of housing. Really, in every community across our country, we're grappling with housing affordability, condition, accessibility, relevance, supply inventory, all of these challenges related to housing. And in the Metro Washington area alone, more than 300,000 households are really a single hardship away from missing rent or a mortgage payment. With the joblessness and loss related to the pandemic, we still face pretty tough times ahead. But the good news is that local governments, companies, researchers, industry groups, banks, mortgage lenders, everybody is thinking about these challenges and how to innovate to find solutions that can give everyone access to affordable, appropriate housing. So today's panelists are really thought leaders and innovators who are supporting communities in pursuit of their housing goals. And I'll start by introducing them. So Akiria Brown is the Homeownership Program Administrator for Arlington County. I first met Akiria doing some interviews, thinking about the economic impact of Virginia housing. And she was so inspirational in the way that she presented the challenges. She really had a deep understanding of home ownership in Arlington and how we could think about beginning to address those challenges. That she was one of the first people I thought of when I was trying to compile this panel. Akiria has a passion for homeownership empowerment and has a background in addition to the homeownership programs in asset management, veteran housing, and homelessness prevention. She has strong relationships throughout the region and serves on a number of advisory councils. Lisa Sturdivant is the chief economist for the Virginia Realtors. Lisa and I have worked together for a long time, and she has been a great colleague and a real inspiration about how to think about data and operationalize that into change. She served as the vice president for research for the National Housing Conference between 2013 and 2016, where she oversaw the organization's research and local outreach. And prior to that, she was the deputy director of the Center for Regional Analysis and an associate research professor at George Mason in the School of Public Policy. And she also worked for Arlington prior to that. So there's some synergies there. And then Andrew McCoy is my colleague at the Virginia Center for Housing Research. As you may have heard before, the Center for Housing Research serves the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we think about affordability and the innovations needed to meet the affordability challenges throughout our state. And Andrew is really the innovator side of our partnership. His main area of research involves diffusion and commercialization of innovative projects in the construction industry. And recently he partnered with the Urban Institute and reviewed HUD's innovation pipeline and set new foundations for leading congressional approval for the HUD Office of Innovation. And we were excited to have him involved in that effort. So those are our wonderful panelists. Thank you guys so much for being here today. And I will go ahead and just kick off the conversation. Andrew, I want to start with you, and I want to ask you to talk a little bit about what industry innovations are on the horizon and what could really transform access to affordable housing. You're muted. Andrew?
Oh, that's right. You're supposed to take yourself off mute. Yeah, I keep learning that, unfortunately. It's great to be here. Thanks, Mel. Thanks for the great introduction. Very nice to be here with you, Akiria and Lisa. And I'm excited for some back and forth and some exciting discussion. I'll just start off by saying I think it's a very exciting time, certainly in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry. But I think in housing, I think what's good for the AEC side of it, the architecture, engineering, and construction side of it, is just as good for the housing industry as well. So a lot of the question is, how do we kind of take changes in the industry and hopefully turn them into ways that we can produce buildings more affordably. We can also create other ways that we build these buildings so that people, the residents who are living in them, can live more affordably. All kinds of different ways that they can live more healthily. You know, there's just so many different innovations right now that are kind of coming out. And I honestly, I think this is something you're going to see some of the biggest change in terms of the construction industry really since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, some of these shifts, they might be efficiency of process, quality of products, dependability of labor. That's a lot of the concern that we've seen more recently in the industry. And they're all kind of transforming the way we produce buildings and the way we look at the production of buildings. And you know, if you looked at the results of the technologies that are changing and then the need for housing right now, I think we're once again seeing housing as kind of a driving force within the larger economy, which is great and should be something that we can all work with to create more affordable options around housing. So I'll stop there and just as an intro. How's that?
So that's great, Andrew. But tell us, you know, about some of the specific technologies that either you're working on or you're tuning into as promising things that could make a difference.
Sure. Well, we're doing a lot more of the construction process off of the construction site right now. So you have a lot of these off-site construction technologies. They are being built in a setting where you can really control the quality, you can control the speed, hopefully, the safety around it. You can also take away some of the variability on site. We've gone through a period where labor in the industry has been, a lot of it after the recession left the industry, and so it was difficult to find a lot of the contractors that were previously in the industry, and so you just had a shortage of labor all across the industry. Well, now we're seeing technologies that can help with that, can make the delivery of those buildings and the scheduling of them a little bit more easy to achieve, just because we're able to not necessarily wait on the labor that is in high demand and short supply on the site. So off-site construction technologies, that's manufactured housing, things like that. More recently, and this is something that Mel knows is a project we're working on. We've been lucky enough to work on a grant from Virginia Housing that looks at introducing technologies into the production cycle. And in this case, we're looking at 3D concrete printing. And the idea here is that, which is kind of interesting, if we look at historically, a lot of the ways that we were able to make housing affordable, it would be by purchasing land and being able to get a good price on the land, knowing that the cost of construction and the ability to kind of squeeze costs out of that was very difficult. It was limited. Well, now what we're seeing is that we're trying to be able to replace specific divisions of work within the construction process with one process. And we're looking at how that might change efficiency, reduce costs. And in the case of the 3D concrete printed house, we are taking, multiple parts of the building. Like if we look at the exterior walls, we're taking the siding, the house wrap, the sheathing, the structure that we have to put into that wall, and maybe the drywall on the inside. And we're replacing it with one process that goes pretty quickly. And if we can have good details, we can control the quality really well. It's a very durable product. Longer term maintenance is reduced. And in the case of this technology we're working with, we can actually make it so that there's insulation between two layers that's kind of sandwiched, and we have a thermal break. So the operation of the residence costs much, much less than it might otherwise. So that we're looking at some of those technologies. There's also all kinds of panelized technologies out there that are great, that do a lot of the same thing I was just talking about. And then I think moving forward, what you're going to see is a lot of the automation of the site that can be actually brought to the site or done off-site through robotics, things like that. So I'll leave it there. How's that?
Yeah, that's great. So our participants in the challenge, many of them are thinking about housing from this angle. How can we create more, better, more affordable housing? But there are many participants thinking of it from a different angle. And so I want to respond to that too, and ask Akiria, you know, your role gives you firsthand experience in relation to access. Just because there's a unit there somewhere on the ground doesn't make it appropriate or even accessible to everyone. And so I wonder if you would talk about what kind of program or policy innovations can complement these construction innovations to help us transform access.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Mel. And I'm really ecstatic to be here. And thank you so much for that warm welcome and introduction. So to your question, I think that comprehensive plans to collaborate regionally is really, really important. And to collaborate to holistically address housing quality, inequalities that are spurred by regional housing policies, and then settlement patterns that are always or often related to the affordability levels within a region, I think are important. And so I think it's important that we intentionally use the collective passion to develop smart goals to address these issues. Otherwise, the cycles will continue. And by cycles, I mean the cycle of inadequate housing, which in a lot of ways leads to inadequate education, which then lends to the increasing gaps in income and wealth. And then it's just a cycle that continues, because then that leads to housing inequities. And so one such plan that I am familiar with was on a recent panel from Enterprise, where it was proposed that a statewide equitable housing share plan would be developed. And in this proposal, it would require each community to ensure that a percentage of its housing stock was affordable at 60% of the area median income, and then 80% of the homeownership stock be affordable. And what this does is that it has this way of collectively conveying to the community that that no community is in this alone, and that we have to work on these longstanding issues together. Not that these things are not already being implemented in some really great capacities, like the work that COG and other organizations are doing. But I think that the viability of such collaboration is only as strong as those that lend fresh ideas to the long-standing issues. And as a collective, it's really important, lastly, that we structure these collaborations to have the people that are impacted the most have them at the table. It's really, really critical that those households have a seat at the table to be able to engage the development community, the policy community, government entities, nonprofits, to just kind of collectively determine the best route for housing within the region.
That makes so much sense. And, you know, the Washington Metro region is now embarking on a regional analysis of impediments to housing. So that's a promising development. Yes. That, yeah, may take us to some of this innovative thinking that you're thinking or talking about, and sort of the importance of it being regional. Lisa, forever ago, you said something that really rang true to me, and I think it was in response to this idea that everybody should have an opportunity to live wherever they want. But you contextualized that for me, that they are also their own agent and they will choose, right? So, you know, you can provide lots of housing in a particular place for a particular group, but that group may not want to live there, or all of that group may not want to live there. And your understanding of the housing supply dynamics in this region, but really just generally, is enlightening. And so I wonder if you would tell us a little bit more about what we're kind of up against in the region, some of the challenges that we face, and even how you might suggest us to start tackling them.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And Thanks for the chance to be here. It's really interesting to hear both Andrew and Akiria talk about how housing is really being lifted up in the conversation now, sort of post-coronavirus, well, once we get post-coronavirus. Hopefully we'll be post-coronavirus. But as we sort of are realizing the value and the importance of housing, maybe in a way not everybody had before, and how, as was mentioned, some folks are a paycheck away, an income loss away from losing that stability of housing. To your question specifically, I think I'm really glad to hear that you mentioned this regional approach. I think we do we're getting better at doing transportation planning better. We are getting regionally, we're doing better at environmental planning regionally. Housing seems to be the sticking point. And so that's kind of where my mind always goes is we could build 3D homes, we can build manufactured homes, we can plan regionally. What does it take though to put a home on the ground in a neighborhood where there's opposition to homes on the ground, right? And so I think this idea of understanding some of the challenges in an urban area like Northern Virginia or like the Washington area, and the concerns that get raised. I'm not answering your question directly, but I wanted to start here because I think that, we often talk a lot about these great new innovations and these models on the construction side, which are so important. And then this idea of planning, which is so important. And I think that the third component is really about communication and education, right? How do you get that planning implemented with those innovative homes on the ground in the places where they're most in demand? And in a place like Arlington, for example, or other places in the metro area, if residents voice concerns about increasing the supply of housing in the community and the pressures it might put on schools or on traffic, there's a lot of us, to be fair, I think I've done this as well. Our first thought is they just don't want new people here. But there is some validity to thinking about how you build new housing in an urban area and like thinking about how to build it. And then and what kinds of housing you can build. And in a place where you have such limited land in an urban built up environment, as you all know, you really have to think about building up, right? And building more densely. And then I always start thinking about what happens when you bump up against what you can build and what people want. And so it's interesting working where in my role now, we're seeing this like surge in demand for single family homes with yards. You're not going to build any single family homes with yards in the core of the Washington metropolitan area. You're not going to build it because there's no land. And if you are going to build them, you're going to tear down a more modest single family home and you're going to build a giant single family home. And so this is where I like find my brain sort of circling around is if we think about this planning and it involves multifamily, it involves townhomes, it involves maybe triplex, duplexes, quadplexes in single family neighborhoods. To Akira's point, do we have families and individuals at the table who are talking about how they want to live and how they might understand how a single family home, there's options to that and what it might look like and why if you feel like that is the kind of home that you think you want, understanding that there might be options that can mimic some of the things you like about that single family option, instead of just saying, forget it, I'm moving to Loudoun or I'm moving to Nashville or I'm moving, because I think that's really what it boils down to is that we're going to talk a lot, I think, about housing that's affordable to folks at the lower and more moderate end of the income spectrum, because that's really the hardest to deliver. But I would argue this sort of whole supply of housing from sort of soup to nuts has to be matched up in some ways with demand and has to be part of a broader conversation about how we live. Because if urban planners, and we all love urban planners love urban environments. Not everybody is an urban planner and not everybody has the same preferences. And so I'm rambling on here, Mel, but to your point, this idea of choice and ensuring that there is sufficient choice and understanding about how people can have access to different kinds of homes within a region ends up being, in my mind, a really interesting challenge.
So if I can just add to that a little bit, right? So as part of the process of understanding how we introduce technology into the market, one of the items that we've started doing more and more is kind of creating personas. and saying, these are the types of, a family would want this basic size home, would want basically these types of technologies, would want, this type of quality, typically, if there's a starter home versus something that is, we're growing the family. And some technologies just don't match with that well. A larger home is going to be difficult to print. So, it's actually really good as a technology for a starter home. And then the question is, how much of the concrete do they really want to see? So you have to get into some of those little details. But I think there's a way to map a little bit to what we're saying, different technologies that would be good solutions for different personas that have different needs, and possibly some might want to be more urban and some might want to be more rural. And so how can that work? How can you make a portfolio that can then be a tool to work with planners and to work with realtors and the industry that's trying to produce it, and then look, take that and map it out a little bit more to say, okay, well, these are the parts of the zoning that really are going to be difficult to accomplish with these technologies, or much more closer to home, how the building code is going to react to this. And so, we have, there's a lot of great work coming out of DHCD where they are trying to get modular specifications into the building code so that it's a statewide kind of, we're ready for it when it comes, and people have a little bit more comfort with that. So anyway, the persona development is something that has worked well in terms of trying to match a little bit more the technologies and what's appropriate or what's not.
Yeah, and one other thing to add to both Lisa and Andrew's points about persona and choice, I think one of the easy questions for us to ask is what, but one of the more nuanced questions is the why, right? So if the what is single family homes, and then we go a step further and we ask the whys, those responses may be, oh, because I want my children to have more area to play. And so it may equate to more parks in the area, or other spaces that would allow for dogs to run or children to meet up with other children. And so I think it really comes down to kind of going a step beyond the what's. We all know that it's great to, to kind of try to achieve one aspect, but then there are other alternatives that can be just as good if we know the why.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up dog parks and parks, because I think that gets to this idea that you can't be planning for housing in isolation. I think there's a lot of communities in Virginia that are doing a good job at comprehensively planning for housing and open space and transportation, but not everywhere. But you just sort of highlighted why it's so important.
I think that the persona development and getting really into taking it further to get into the why is what innovators need, right? Because if we think about people introducing a new technology to a market, they have to convince the consumer that this is an important part of their life, right? They have to think about the market and in some ways develop the market. And it's a huge challenge in the housing industry because this is the biggest investment of most people's lives. They want to do something safe. They want to do something that they feel confident in. And getting them to branch out into these new technologies, whether that be, a concrete house or a house in a sort of different location or of a different configuration than they're used to, or of a different financial configuration than they're used to, is a big ask. So I think that that's part of the reason that innovation moves a little bit more slowly. And so there's a question from the audience for Andrew, and I wonder if we could kick off here, but I would love to hear all of your guys' input on what we can do to appeal to people in this context. So the question is, what barriers exist that prevent builders and developers from more rapidly embracing offsite construction technologies and efficiencies? Do these require investments in facilities and machinery that must be recaptured over time? So this is just one example of that. And Andrew, if you could go ahead.
Sure. I think part of the way we look at innovation is it's only as good as the supply chain and all the stakeholders and their willingness to work with it and accept it. And that's everybody we're talking about right now. It's not just the group that's supposed to take the innovation and push it forward necessarily. So we've had a lot of, in the past, and this is something we studied in the HUD report, but we've had a lot of kind of top down. We're gonna drive innovation at the federal level or the state level, and then we didn't have a lot of people from the bottom up wanting to support it. Or we've had innovation that's been driven from the bottom up, but it's run into roadblocks from the top, just because it's difficult to get it to diffuse into the market maybe. So some of those roadblocks, immediately off the top of my head right now, we're seeing obviously building code is a big one, right? You want to make sure that we produce housing that's safe and healthy and is going to be good for the resident. That's a lot of what's happening with that. For example, with offsite construction is you have inspections that happen at the site of where it's produced. And so it's third-party inspections, and you work with the locality to make sure that they agree with it. And there's a lot that's happening with that has really changed the way we look at modular construction. And Modular Buildings Institute, a big shout out to them. They've really pushed a lot of this and made it something that's working in the market now. The other thing would be tackling that from the statewide or national building code or international building code perspective of how do we look at ways that we can kind of create more information that makes people more comfortable with the product that's going to show up. In the end, nobody wants to produce a bad quality product. I mean, that's not what people are trying to do, but they are trying to use innovation in ways to produce it for less. And so, there's a lot of push and pull there. I think sometimes, you want to think in terms of the person who's going to be purchasing as well, and the person who's going to be representing the purchaser. So you have a long time we talked about kind of the MLS and how to get greening into the MLS and make it something that's valued a little bit more in terms of when someone's selling a house, so that there's a premium there possibly for people to kind of adopt green. And in the end, a lot of what pushed the green adoption was code, because we wanted to drive energy standards in a different direction in some ways. So there's just a lot of ways to look at it. I do think it requires investments. And so that's what's so great about this community innovation grant that's happening right now is it's improbable that the for-profit market is willing to invest tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars into equipment to test it and see if it's going to happen. And so the idea of research and development arms of, especially in the construction industry, a lot of it's much more of a smaller, the builders are not necessarily producing more than 20 homes a year. And so it's difficult for that investment to happen. So having programs that reach down and work with in the industry, help people understand it, disseminate information, and help different groups try out these technologies. I think it's really important. And so that's part of what you're seeing. There are different reasons we can go into at a different time as to why it hasn't worked sometimes in the past, but it's really important that we start seeing some of these investments, and it's not necessarily going to always happen from the private market.
Yeah, and if I can just add to what Andrew said, and this idea of using innovation grants as a way to fund research and development and for us to understand how to make these new models possible, I think it's a really good opportunity also to think about the communication side of it. Andrew, you touched on this about sort of educating folks about, about what new models of homes could look like, or new ways of living could look like. And I know, Mel, you and I work together so closely on affordable housing like projects that were sort of more targeting housing to folks at low and moderate incomes, and quantifying demand. We can do that. Quantifying what's available on the ground, a little bit harder, but we can do that. Communicating why the community should get behind a plan that rezones for more housing, that I feel like is a nut that still needs to be cracked. And again, for those who are out there who may not be construction engineers, or they may not be housing researchers, but they may be really interested in how we communicate about innovation, or how we communicate about changes kind of in the broader economy or the broader world, I feel like there should be an emphasis on the communication and the marketing and the education around some of this innovation, because people's minds, as you suggested, Andrew, we don't change overnight. We're very slow when it comes to how we live. We in America, have lived the same way for a really long time. We love our cars, we love our yards. I mean, and I know I'm generalizing, but and I will say, for those of us who live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, Akira and I live up here, it is super helpful to get out of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area to see the range of the ways folks live. And there is a really strong sort of thinking that there's one way to do this. And I think this education piece could be really interesting.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree, Lisa. And I think to add to that, in the education realm, I think it's also important to understand that communities are being overwhelmed with reasons why they need to change, right? So it's along the lines of transportation, there's education, there's housing. And so in some ways, I think it's also important to be cognizant of what other initiatives are being funneled through that process at any given time, because you do not want a community to feel like they are under a deluge of change agents coming from every direction, because then you start to wonder, well, did I move here? Was it a right decision? Because it's obviously not working, right? And so everyone wants to change everything. And so I just think it's important to be cognizant of the timing with regard to these projects. And I think we can always say, well, there's never a good time for a revolution. Yeah, I get it. But at the end of the day, you know, it is important to just kind of have those things in the back of our minds.
That's a really good point. A student just sent me an article about how we're going into neighborhoods and we're now saying we're going to put parks and we're going to do green spaces. And the community that is there, they had a perfectly good way of working across the community, and we're disrupting. And there's disillusionment, right? That there's a feeling of that's not the way we have lived here, historically. So how do you do it in a way that's that's thoughtful? That's a really good point.
So I wonder if we might move into solutions and things that you guys think are viable and interesting. What do you think might be the most salient changes, for example, that households are looking for, they want to see? And if someone has a new idea that they really think could transform the way that we do housing, particularly in the Washington metro area, how might they introduce that effectively so that it actually happens? And one of the folks that's a participant right now has asked about the digital divide in the greater Washington, D.C. area, and about challenges connecting existing homes and communities to high-speed internet. And I think because of the pandemic, especially, this is a very salient thing. People are interested in being better connected in their homes, for example. So I think it's one example. If you guys want to address that along the way, that's great. But just anything that you think could either nudge us or transform us that would be acceptable.
Yeah, I'll start off. I think one of the things that I am seeing as a promising ideology is that communities are becoming laser focused on racial disparities and how those disparities have impacted housing development and policy and programs. And so there's no question that housing access has and continues to be unequal. But I think communities like Arlington and other communities across the country are considering their role in contributing to and also closing that significant racial and economic gap in housing. And And so particularly communities that are exploring the legacy of deliberate policies and zoning choices that led to underinvestment and isolation in Black communities. And in Arlington's Missing Middle study, along with the county board's commitment to racial equity, as well as others that are being undertaken across the country, I think it's really important that we consider how concentrated poverty and exclusionary zoning and the lack of diverse housing types have lended to this less racially, less economically inclusive communities. And I think most communities are now coming to the realization that those land use policies and those zoning practices really need to change, and they need to change quickly. So I think that is certainly a step in the right direction, and some are making longer strides than others, but I think it's certainly a necessary aspect of housing development.
I think you're absolutely right. And someone just put in the chat an example of the Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights area in the DC region. And, you know, I've been looking at this neighborhood for a long time now. They've been doing some things really great, and some things have been a struggle. Are there any examples, Kyria, that you know of that you feel like folks are getting the combating gentrification, creating more equal access, any place that they're getting it right, neighborhood or city?
I think there's a lot of work that is being done. I know that Hennepin County and Minneapolis, that area, they've done a lot to change zoning and to change their policies. Some of those policies have had adverse impacts, but I think it's important that those communities understand that no change is going to be without some pitfalls, and we just have to keep trudging ahead and keep moving forward. But I know that there are other communities that are moving a little slower than that. And there's also, as we spoke about, that pushback when we talk about creating new policies. There are some households or families that would feel like they are being left behind in that. And so the timing, again, and the messaging, to Lisa's point, of those conversations is really critical, because I think at the end of the day, it would be really, really easy for us to say, well, these are the moral things to do. This is the right thing to do, but that's not always enough. And I think we have to be smarter in how we communicate how these changes need to take place.
So you're about to say something before I.
Oh, no, that's really interesting. And the question that you had posed a little earlier was just about kind of what things could we do that would make a difference, either nudge us in a certain way or maybe find ourselves in a very different situation. I have a few different ideas, but one I wanted to mention here, because we were talking about regionalism early on. So Mel, like, this is an idea, right? There's no limits, right? We don't have to operate in the political world we live in right now, right? So, but it seems to me that a regional housing plan with a regional taxation sort of structure to fund housing at the regional level would be a key way to make those investments in the neighborhoods that you all were just talking about, and in the neighborhoods that are best connected to jobs, but maybe the most expensive to develop in. So that is one pie in the sky idea, because I think that, we talk about land use, when we talk funding housing, affordable housing, you talk about land use and zoning, which we certainly should talk more about, but that gap financing to make up the difference between the cost of building the housing and the cost that people and the amount people can pay. We'll get at some of that through innovation, but there's always going to be this gap. So where does that money come from? And if it doesn't come from right now it comes from either the local jurisdiction themselves or from some state sources or a few federal sources. But if this is a regional problem, then it just feels to me like one innovative solution might be for a regional housing trust fund, and they're very, very uncommon, right? So there's one out in Silicon Valley area. Maybe Minneapolis has a little bit of something, but nobody has a taxation authority that like is a regional tax to fund affordable housing, as far as I know.
Yeah, and it seems like if we went down that road of regionalism and a fair share, then it would be easier to do a credit system or a tax system, much like, water or environmental
And
impacts.
it would be, and it's hard anywhere, but don't you think it's even harder in the DC, Maryland, Virginia metropolitan area? I mean, you can imagine doing it in one state, it's going to be hard enough to get localities on board, but good luck. Again, I'm such a Debbie Downer, right? So it just feels like it would be a really interesting idea to keep in the mix, but very much a challenge.
Yeah, and we have a blue sky world right now. I mean, in a smart city challenge where folks are competing for just good ideas, to get good ideas out there. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we need to be thinking about. I mean, of course, we also have to think about the practicality of it, because that's just part of it. But this is a good setting to think about those ideas that could really change this. Andrew, do you want to weigh in?
Sure, but maybe from a different angle a little bit. I think we have the tendency to throw technology and say, oh, it's going to be this great equalizer. And it's just, in some ways it's not. In some ways, to that original question that you said, Mel, it needs to be. It needs to be something that everyone is given access to at some level, especially we've realized this during the pandemic, or times where parents need some flexibility so that they can have access to education. Yeah, I mean, it's been a rough year, right? And so I want to caution us to say that we throw technology at things and it's always going to be the savior. But at the same time, if we're thoughtful about it and we try to understand which technologies then can really help with stabilizing housing and stabilizing community, and the word that I've heard used a lot that I really like is not resilience in terms of communities that go through a major natural disaster, but more the ability for people to have resilience in terms of their housing for other parts of their life. So it could be medical, it could be the need to take on an aging parent, or all kinds of different sides. That there are technologies that I think really could be accessible and help with that. And an example of that I was talking to a team about yesterday was we've done some work where we really looked at the energy efficiency of units and what that meant for the energy bill that they're paying, and what that meant for the bottom line of how much extra money they have a year to put towards food or books or anything, right? That goes a little bit towards that resiliency side of, how do we make sure that we're making the best choices for how the housing will be produced, so that, right, that it can offer options for people to have more resiliency. And that could include obviously the digital divide and items like that too. So keeping our eyes open a little bit, making sure that we are thinking broader about some of this technology is not necessarily going to, it's not going to solve everything, but some technologies that we can work with really will be important to helping, from operations, maintenance, all that kind of thing, the longer term. We often think about kind of getting someone into a house, but we don't think about the fact that there's a long tail to that process.
There's a related question from the audience, and they're wondering about opportunities to reduce operating expenses of the home, and whether or not that can be passed on to lower income households and create some more of the sustainability or resilience. And Andrew, I know that you've done some research in this realm, so I wonder if you might quickly answer that before we.
Well, I guess I'll answer it with what I was just talking about. So we looked at, if we build to a certain standard of construction, and we look at the behavior of the residents in the unit, and we understand the technologies that went into the unit, can we actually model ways that behavior or technology correlates with energy use positively or negatively, up or down? And then we actually were able to interrelate, to look at the interaction effects of certain behavior with certain types of technologies. An example would be we're building building multifamily housing for families, and we put a highly efficient refrigerator into the unit, or a highly efficient thermostat into the unit. Well, often in a family, you have so many people touching that technology, right? They're pushing the thermostat up and down. Well, that's actually the way that you expend, you have more energy use. More people are opening the fridge, closing the fridge. So making some choices based on kind of those technologies and what, what we can do. If we build buildings really tightly, we can often set a temperature year round, or it might change twice a year. And it really doesn't need to be that we assume we can go to the thermostat and change how everything, how the comfortability is in the unit. We can design them to be comfortable. So and then what that does is it actually, it has a serious effect on the bottom line of how much people pay in terms of electricity. So things like that. We're also learning a lot more about how families work in terms of, at 5 o'clock, everybody comes home and they plug in their device, and maybe not at 5 o'clock, but sometime around there, everybody plugs in their devices. The flat screens might come on. It's a lot more accessibility to technology like that. So you see these spikes during the day of different times, and so we have ways that we can work with people, educate them on ways to be more efficient with what they have and what they're doing. And I think it goes back to what Lisa and Kyria are talking about with education too, and getting people to understand that it's important, that there are really serious effects to using LED lights that are efficient, and things like that. So.
All right, and I want to just encourage everybody. We have about 14 minutes left until 1. So any of the participants, if you have questions, we're happy to kind of go into that Q&A and can kind of just continue discussing along the way. Someone has a question: what are the prospects for integrating Internet of Things into smart housing, for example, to enable active aging or senior citizens? And I would love for all of you guys to kind of address this importance of technology, especially for low-income groups, senior groups, other sort of marginalized groups that may not have as ready access to just equip their smart home themselves. I'll
chime in a little bit, because this sort of touches on an idea that I was thinking about back when we were talking a little bit about solutions and the role technology can play. We mentioned earlier about how internet access has become so evident how important it is, and those gaps in access to high-speed internet have really been made clear. It seems to me that one of these solutions that may not be very popular, but I'd love to get some responses to it. And I saw there was a question about Reston in the chat as well. What if we thought about innovation in housing, and at the same time we were continuing to think about innovation in work? And what if this work from home trend that we've been seeing, which I get it, it is for one segment of the population that is very advantaged, and I recognize this. What if we think about innovation in work and how we work, and gosh, doesn't that change our options for where we live if high-speed internet is available as a utility, as a kind of standard option? And while most of the time we think about when folks move further from the central business district, our immediate thought is, well, that creates sprawl, it creates traffic congestion, it creates environmental challenges. But again, just pie in the sky, what if we built a little self-contained Reston, right? Out where it's easier to build, where people have really good access to internet, can work from home. And there are all sorts of equity issues, there's all sorts of obstacles. But I guess my whole point is to Andrew's idea about technology not always being a solution to everything. There are ways I think we can think about how technology changes the way we live and the place we live in maybe a way we haven't thought of as much before the pandemic and before this. So that doesn't have anything to do with the Internet of Things, but I do think this idea of recognizing the internet as a necessary utility like water and sewer and gas has got to be front of mind of any policymaker these days.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I've actually been thinking about that same idea and wondering whether or not this our increasing dependency on technology from home will be in some way a catalyst to there being migrations more towards suburban areas as opposed to the cities, where you can have your home with your single family with a backyard. And so, yeah, I'm really curious to kind of see what this looks like, knowing that most of the time people live where their job is, and they need that job in order to have benefits. It's really, really important that people are able to now navigate the world a little bit more freely. I've got a number of colleagues that no longer live in the region, have literally just kind of, even, I mean, I know a couple are temporary, but just to be able to live with family, or where your family is, or where you grew up, or what an ideal living situation, and still be able to maintain your employment and your benefits and your job, I think is really, really important. I think it will in some way impact how people move around the country, and what our housing needs will be over the next decade or so.
I just want to chime in just really briefly, because I love the way that you talked about this idea of choice, right? People who chose to live with family. And I know that we've mentioned this on the panel before, but this raises really interesting questions about equity and about those for whom that choice is not available. If I work as a cashier at Giant, I can't live remotely. I can't live where I need to go into my office, right? Into my space. And so I think that some of the challenges with innovation is, are we considering the impacts on equity when we think about these things? So I'll sort of criticize my own suggestion just a minute ago, right? This idea of building these communities are great, but if you're going to continue to maintain a lot of key resident services in a place where it's really expensive to build housing still, that leaves a lot of people behind. And I think as we think about innovation and these innovation challenges, I'm really hoping that equity becomes a really sort of evaluative, like a criteria against which some of these ideas are judged, are based.
That's a great point. And I hadn't considered that, but in thinking about what that would look like, for an example, you may have someone that had employment here in DC and decided to move to Iowa. Well, the cost of living in Iowa is different than it is here in this region, but that household continues to work where they were working and have those same benefits, and it, in some ways, grows that income gap even more, because now that household has less expenses and they are maintaining the same income that they were receiving. And I know that's very nuanced and in the weeds, but it is certainly something that is very plausible at this moment.
Yeah, and I will say we're seeing it on the ground. Home prices in Harrisonburg, Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia, in Winchester, Virginia, they are up faster than in most of the rest of the state. And a big driver of that is higher income folks from Northern Virginia choosing, right, the folks who can choose, to enter markets where the at-place median household income is a lot lower. And so the existing residents are increasingly being priced out of very limited home ownership opportunities by higher income folks who are moving out. And so I think, again, this idea of choice is really important. And I always come back to, well, who has the choice, who doesn't? Because it's a little misnomer to, right, as I said before. But
I think that there's another really good example of this on the horizon that I've had the opportunity to recently work with some West Virginia communities that are right in that like corridor to Dulles. They can get to Dulles in 2 hours. And now Virgin has introduced the idea of developing a hyperloop that goes, right either into DC or to Dulles, and they're already seeing an out-migration from the DC metro area into West Virginia in anticipation of this, people making investments in land and so on. And the housing prices there, Akiria, in earlier discussions, talking about $500,000 for a single room in Arlington, and we're talking about $50,000 in West Virginia for a whole big house. And to think about the kind of migration impacts there and the gentrification is stunning. And if everyone can live in West Virginia now and that can kind of work remotely and take the Hyperloop, do we now have, again, this urban gutting issue? What's happening? Yeah.
Well, and I think that's where we talk about adaptive reuse and the ability. So, maybe it's not always the solution of taking Reston and building it over here. It's finding the strip malls that, that just have not been viable for a while, and figuring out ways that they can be retrofitted and turned into, housing. Obviously, you have to have the ability to have zoning around that, and you have long-term plans that might get in the way of. So you have to be careful, but maybe we start thinking in those terms. I think you're right. I think we've all felt the pain of what some of us were, had as a luxury, which is kind of this ability to separate, work life maybe with family life, or the pressures of family and what that means on our ability to have kind of a stable work environment, things like that now I think people are going to change, and they're going to be a lot more flexible if they can choose it. If they can't choose it, we need to figure out ways to help them, and hopefully that's something that can be done and in a good way and help a lot of people.
I think that your point about, can we design building technologies that make us more adaptive, is really important. And in building technologies across the board, Andrew, a long time ago, we talked about a parking deck in Charlottesville that was anticipating autonomous vehicles. So they went on and wired the parking so it could be turned into housing, right? And in Des Moines, we're having conversations right now about, they had been trying to build up the city center, but now COVID has caused an exodus. So how can we use the offices we're not going to be using anymore, and the housing that people don't want anymore, to try to reconfigure and make this place desirable again? So can you guys talk a little bit about what adaptations you would like to see, what technologies you think could move this?
Well, I'm just looking at some of the questions and answers quickly. In terms of seniors and things like that, I don't know if that's really necessarily the adaptive reuse as much, but it could be. I think we are seeing that there's a lot of technology that's going to help with people as they age in place. It's going to make it a lot. I mean, I'm feeling the effects of being kind of a sandwich generation. I have kids that aren't necessarily very young, but they're still pretty young. And then I'm also feeling the need to go take care of my parents much more. And I think the technology is going to help us be able to do that and have good housing choices. There was a push with something in Virginia where you were able to put a medical kind of home in the back for aging in place, and as long as it had medical purposes, then the zoning would allow it suddenly, based on state code, things like that. But Lisa, it looked like you were going to say something too.
I'm sorry. Well, you just got me thinking about the aging in place issue. I did a paper for the AARP on innovative building design to enable multi-generational living, I guess. And so, Andrew, I wonder, have you seen here in the States or in Virginia, like in some of the Asian countries, I did case studies on these homes that have movable walls, right? They could be, particularly in multifamily buildings, you could have a studio when you're young, and then you kind of move a wall and then you take over. Is that something that we can do here?
Well, I think we can reconfigure. I haven't seen a lot, unless you have kind of a studio. You see the old warehouses where they do some cool wall structures, things like that. But I think we can also look at how we build multifamily, for example, that can be reconfigured. It can allow for more access to people who need first level access versus how you would have people living in higher floors, things like that move people in and out as they need more levels of care, and then communities around it that are built to offer them independence first, and then semi-independence, and so ways that the current infrastructure could allow that. The part of the problem there is, of course, there's just so much, there's not much inventory and so much demand, right? We heard the story of Jack and Jill the first, who decided they wanted to downsize, right? And so they went to look for a ranch house that was on one level, and they ran into Jack and Jill the third, who were trying to buy it. So now they're bidding against each other. Of course, Jack and Jill the first have more money, you know, to bid against it. And by the way, they found out that Jack and Jill the second owned it and really decided they were getting too much rent, that they didn't want to sell it at all. So they weren't going to do it when they all went to the open house, you know. So it's conflated, you know, in a lot of ways, and it's a tough one. Now I'm being the downer.
Akiria, we're running toward the end, but I want to give you a chance to weigh in before we end, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Just briefly, I think what all of this is kind of coming back to is the importance of crafting policies, procedures, and housing that are human-centered. So, you know, human-centered is an ideology, whether in technology or in healthcare, but it's also important in housing and in other aspects of our everyday lives. And I think the more complicated our housing is in our communities, the more complicated our interrelationships become, the more important human-centered ideals will be. And I think if we kind of keep those things in the forefront, we can let our communities really kind of dictate to us what's needed and what's required and what's going to be sustainable for the next generation, because that's a whole nother conversation when we talk about generations to come and how the decisions that we're making today will impact subsequent generations, and how critical it is for us to make those human-centered choices, regardless of how tough they may be, in order to put those next generations in a good position.
Well, I could not have said it better. So
Right.
We are at 1:01 now. So I have to allow everyone to leave if they want. Brianna, I'm not sure if we're allowed to kind of stay behind and answer questions maybe from participants, but we certainly will do that if it's possible and you guys have time. But I want to take the time right now to say thank you guys so much for joining this panel and helping our participants think through their projects and problems and solutions that they might present and how to make them better, more viable. So thank you very much. And Brianna says we can stay a bit longer if we want. So you guys are free to leave now if you like, but if you're willing to stay, we can pay attention to the Q&A, keep chatting.
Here, I'll answer just quickly. There's a question about price per square foot, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants to know how much are we going to save exactly, and what's the exact cost of things. So innovation is not cheap. It's expensive when you first start, but obviously at a scalable level, it becomes something that can then drive costs down. So in the modular housing world, we're seeing anywhere from 10 to 15% savings after you reach a certain scale. What I think is interesting about a lot of the work that we're seeing in the energy efficiency and modular offsite construction, what it does is it's not just as much about the immediate cost savings. It's also about how it opens up the ability, especially from a development scale, to access different levels of financing and different terms of your financing. It opens up all kinds of levels for residents to be able to live there less expensively and save, so they might even actually qualify for a little bit more of a house or a little bit more of a unit because the operating costs are different now. So that we're seeing how this kind of has an effect well beyond the actual innovation itself, but on the system around it that everybody has kind of locked into for a long time as to how it's going to work. Well, now maybe you actually can qualify for a better loan on the development process itself, things like that. So that's kind of exciting, and I think that's what's going to help drive a lot of this. But yeah, if we look at specific technologies, building to a green standard will bring down your energy bill considerably. In terms of price per square foot, we're hearing that the concrete printing in some places is bringing the cost down 10%, something like that. We worked with a electrical contracting group who would create basically prefabricated whole systems for upfits of buildings. And they would go in, they would ask people to give them plans, and then they would walk in and they would present to them, listen, we can do this job for this amount less. And they estimated that they could do it for 30% less. And so they went in, and the first 5 contractors they talked to, they were laughed out of the room. They were told, we are not that inefficient. There's just no way you can do it. So they finally, on the 6th one, they went in and they said, listen, here's the deal. We can do it for 8% less. And, people said, okay, well, we'll try it. We'll try it. Well, eventually they started being able to pass on more and more savings. But for a while there, they were making 22% on it, right? Because the contractors just wouldn't believe them. There's just so many different ways to look at it. But yes, increasingly, it is bringing down the cost, I think. It's not increasing. It starts off by being often one-to-one. And then hopefully people are finding ways to be more efficient.
So I have to jump on another call, but I just want to say thank you guys so much for such a vibrant conversation, really thought-provoking. And I look forward to us implementing some of these strategies in the near future. I'm sure I'll see you again, but thanks again.